As a former agnostic, one of the biggest proponents for coming to understand and eventually fully convert to theism was the first cause argument for God's existence. The idea being that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe had a beginning and cannot have merely come from non-existence or nothing. Therefore, the universe had a cause, which we would understand to be God. However, it is that final premise that is controversial, the idea that it is God who is the first cause. Is it far-fetched, or even fallacious to say such a thing? Well, we're going to observe the greatest counter-arguments to the first cause in order to deepen our understanding of the reality of God and His creation. In being fair to the opposing side, I will list the main and most convincing counter-arguments to the first cause, which stem from multiple points of logic that oppose certain and multiple premises of the argument at once. Objection 1. The first cause does not have to be God. To say the first cause is God would be to commit a God of the gaps fallacy, in which we place God in the seat of unexplained phenomena. Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. Addressing that counter-argument that to place God in an area of unexplained phenomena is a God of the gaps fallacy is completely true and something I agree with. We should not be as ignorant as to say that every odd occurrence or coincidence is merely God, albeit without any good reason or motives of credibility to justify that position. However, foundationally, this argument conflates observational data with ontological metaphysics. When an apologist argues the first cause, they're not seeking out a gap in unexplained reality, but rather trying to come to a rational understanding of the nature of reality per se. Scientifically and philosophically, we can come to a confident notion that space, time, and matter did not exist before the universe, meaning that the proponents of the cause would have to be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, which is how classical theism has always defined the nature of God. God is not an object or physical property in the universe that causes certain events to arise. His very essence is his existence, because of the very fact that he was all that was before. He is not separate from his existence, or that his existence is inside him or around him. He just is the standard of existence, logic, consciousness, morality, and the fabric of reality itself. Furthermore, because we know of the universe's infinite expansion, it is difficult to justify how a finite, illogically ordered process like chance or any other commonly used naturalistic explanation can create an infinite and continuing process, because it does not possess the infinite power to create infinite and logically ordered reality in the first place. Therefore, we can come to understand that the proponent of creation is one of infinite power. Reality in itself is tangible and able to be studied empirically due to the philosophical presupposition that is self-evident to all people that the universe is ordered, tangible, and its concepts can be deduced from reason. This is a fact we would not expect to understand or even have a conscious conclusion of without a tangible, sensible, and logical creator who not only gives us this logic, but leaves footprints of his identity as logic itself throughout creation and its order, and in the very fact that we can do scientific study in the first place. Consciousness also is a great issue when dealing with this objection, because it cannot be easily concluded that consciousness itself can come from an otherwise unconscious concept or being that is creating all things. Even deeper, an unconscious being or process could not see past its own unconsciousness and realize that it can create consciousness, because then it would be conscious. It is quite the same as saying that it is by blind chance that all things are created, because we know reality and existence to be tangible, empirically observable, ordered with laws that keep it existing and free from chaotic reality-defying events that tear the fabric completely. It is almost completely unlikely that a blind, unordered, unconscious process can create ordered processes and secondary causes like evolution, existence, consciousness, laws, and consistent non-contradictory elements in the universe that don't cause it to completely fall apart. Thus, if there was only nothing or chance or some other commonly utilized naturalistic explanation that created the universe, if the properties that chance or a blind process has to create the universe is spaceless, timeless, immaterial reality, then it couldn't even create a universe containing space, time, and matter in the first place. Also, the universe is a contingent being. It is a thing that can exist or cannot exist. The universe has a possibility to not exist, yet it does, in the same way that people, art pieces, movies, shows, and books have a possibility not to exist. Furthermore, the universe is properly ordered from the beginning to sustain itself without chaos ensuing, and is ordered in such an exact way that it can hold reality and existence together without fracturing. it is highly improbable that such conditions can arise from mere chance, as one could argue a multiverse, which makes the first cause issue an even more difficult one, because now you have to explain what cause is generating these multiverses. It does not solve the problem, but jumbles the logic up even more. As it would be with human art, we tend to see that the greatest proof that the artist exists is not contained within the art itself, but the fact that there is art to begin with. There is an existence in the first place. Thus, when we use the first cause argument, our goal is not to try and fill an odd and scientifically challenging gap in understanding, but is a realization of the ontological foundations of existence itself, which is ordered to sustainability. The second objection states that we cannot make an application of universal realities to extra-universal realities. It could very well be that, logically speaking, the same concept of creation does not apply outside of space, time, and matter as it would within. Therefore, God is not sufficient to be the first cause. However, this counter-argument conflates physics with logic, and pertaining to epistemology is self-contradictory. The idea is the causal principles may not be the same outside of the universe as it would be inside the universe where causal principles are required. Yet it fundamentally misunderstands the fact that causality or creation is not a physical law or property, as it would be with thermodynamics or gravity, which only bears its applications within the universe itself and is not present outside of it. These laws are principles within being, while causality is the principle of being itself. Furthermore, the very fact that we know scientifically the universe began in the first place shows within itself that the same standard of causality exists outside of the universe as it does inside. As we addressed earlier, nothing cannot create everything. Thus, a causal factor created the universe, just as causal factors create flowers or life. It has the same application to the beginning as it would be in the present fabric of existence. So in the very fact that we have been caused and effects have been made because of the cause shows that the same principle and idea applies to whatever process or being was outside of the universe, albeit these effects that came from the beginning of the universe are not natural, uncontrolled effects, but evidently controlled and ordered effects, which also shows that an ordered level and understanding of how existence should have ordered causes and effects, which are non-contradictory and hold together the fabric of existence, also pre-exist before creation. The very fact that any process or being has a thought process or idea of how the universe should be ordered so that it can exist and not fall apart upon the creation event shows us that the same standard of effective cause and effect existed in the sense that it existed as an idea. Thus, the standard is still present in pre-existent reality. However, one could argue further that if this same concept still exists, why not with God? We will address that later, but hang on to that, because that is a good point and key to understanding this. The third objection goes as follows. God is perfect and unchanging. Thus, why would God have any reason or motive to create the universe if he is already in a state of absolute perfection? Creating a changing universe would meddle with that state of perfection. Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. The foundations of this argument are lacking in the very fact that it humanizes God and makes the presupposition that God is merely acting out of psychological necessity or a lack of something as human beings would otherwise act. However, creation makes complete sense if we are to assume that the God of classical theism is the first cause of all things. Yes, it is true, God cannot acquiesce anything because God is everything and lacks nothing. Humans, on the other hand, want to acquire things out of the lack thereof. The brunt of the objection, essentially, is that God is not infinite because he needs to create a universe to acquire a lack of something he doesn't already possess in his pre-universal state of perfection. However, this presupposes that God needed to create the universe in the first place, because he very much did not need to create the universe, because like humans and properties within the universe had a beginning and had a chance to not exist at all. It is contingent. However, we can see in the very act of creation the doctrine of God's infinite goodness is expressed in the very fact that he would create the universe in the first place. The infinitely expanding universe reflects the infinite love of God pouring out to all people. That fact that he loves and is so good that he would not hoard perfection all to himself out of greed, but create humans in his image and incarnate onto earth so that he may resonate with the suffering and grief of humans, so that they may not be alone, and most importantly, so that they can share in that perfection with him. Nothing is a greater reflection of God's infinite goodness and love than that. Furthermore, creating a changing universe does not meddle with or alter God's perfection or immutability in any way, because the universe is not mixed with God, nor does it add anything to him, but is an external and separate reality, an infinite universe that reflects his infinite love and goodness. In the same way that an author does not lose any of their skill or change any of their hardwired components of their nature when they write a new book, so does God, because the universe is not God, but a reflection of himself. Ironically, the very fact that any concept of change exists at all in the fabric of reality and doesn't lead to destruction shows that there is an unchanging order in place to keep change balanced but always working. However, it works in such a way that the universe is preserved and does not fracture. The very fact that we can see change working in reality and movement still happening and existence continuing despite the change is a greater testament to God's providence than if it were not the case. Furthermore, creation could not be immutable because it would just be God. There cannot be one attribute of God that exists in reality without all the others simultaneously, because infinite and complete immutability, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence all rely on one another to exist. Thus, you cannot have a perfectly unchanging universe without it just being God. It needs to possess actuality and potentiality. If the universe is expected to exist as a created and finite concept, then it intrinsically would have to have the concept of change written into it. Also to note, when I say finite concept, that is not rejecting the fact that the universe is in a state of infinite expansion, but is to say that the universe will never reach a point of completion because there is no stopping point to its expansion. In a certain sense, it is finite and constantly changing. On the other hand, God is complete infinity and completely unchanging because he is already complete, while the universe isn't. The fourth objection goes as follows. In quantum mechanics, virtual particles that exist and cease to exist in and out of reality do not have any form of detectable cause. Thus, to say that anything that begins to exist has a cause is a shaky premise, because we have proven that some things can begin to exist without a cause. Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. I listed this argument because it sounds very convincing and put together in a very uniform and seemingly empirical manner, because it lists scientific evidence for why the first cause is an impossibility. However, this is not the case when the evidence being listed is an inaccurate understanding of how virtual particles even work and what the first cause aims to show. The main issue that causes the argument to completely fall apart is its incomplete understanding of virtual particles. When we say that God created all things from nothing, we mean absolute non-being. Yet virtual particles do not appear from absolute non-being, but from the quantum vacuum, which is a tangible, ordered, and active fluctuation of energy that actually has laws that govern the process. Thus, virtual particles do not pop into existence from absolute non-being, but from the quantum vacuum, which is the exact opposite. Therefore, this objection is completely insufficient on scientific grounds. The fifth objection goes as follows. If everything that begins to exist needs a cause, then what is the cause of God? The logic is hypocritical, and the premise contradicts itself. Therefore, God is not an efficient first cause because he himself would need a cause by this logic. This argument is one of the most common counter-arguments you see from skeptics, especially on the internet, which is disappointing because if you had just read and comprehended the actual premise more carefully, you would see how this conclusion is nonsensical. The premise reads that everything that begins to exist has a cause, contingent things that can begin to exist or have a chance to not exist. If we were attempting to argue that every single thing has a cause, then the objection would be completely correct. However, we are speaking of contingent agents, not every agent, including the primary agent, which is God. God is the necessary being that allows any tangible concept or room for existence in the first place to be remotely formulated. Furthermore, there can be no creator of God, or the creator of God, because this would lead to infinite regression, which is logically impossible. Something has to be unnecessary and uncaused, even if you don't believe it's God. There has to be a necessary and uncaused foundation to all things, whether you believe it to be the universe itself or another factor. Is it hard to comprehend? Yes. However, to say that because it's hard to comprehend it cannot be true is inherently fallacious and would be hard for many to be convinced by on its own. The sixth objection goes as follows. Before the universe began, God was not a creator, but when he created the universe, he became one. If we are to assume that God is immutable, then how can we justify the theology of God's immutability with the very act of creation itself? Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. Again, the objection sounds good, but ignores a fundamental fact about reality before the universe, the very fact that there was no time in the first place. There was no time where God was not the creator because, well, there just was no time in the first place. Time is merely the measurement of change throughout the universe. God exists in an endless present where there is no before or future, but simply acts instantaneously in this endless present and forms time, space, and matter. He wasn't just waiting around to create, but created in that single instantaneous present. However, even then, God's act of creation is one unchanging act in and of itself. However, it is the effects produced from that one act that are changing. Being the creator is not an intrinsic change within God, but a relational change. It does not at all contradict with God's immutability. The seventh and final objection goes as follows. Newton's first law of thermodynamics clearly states that within an isolated system, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only change forms. The universe is an isolated system, and the amount of energy has to be constant. However, the first cause argument claims that God created energy out of nothingness. Therefore, the theology is scientifically impossible, and God is not a sufficient first cause. This objection is one of my favorites of the first cause, because again, it uses an empirical piece of data to show that this is false, so there's an actual uniformity and sensibility to this argument, which makes it so favorable in my eyes if you're attempting to argue for a position like atheism. It's what I would probably use if I were in that position, but despite that fact, it is still extremely problematic. It severely conflates the rules of reality with the creation of the rules themselves. The first law of thermodynamics posits a law of physical change. It is showing how energy acts once it has begun to exist. Again, God has not taken pre-existent matter and turned it into the universe. This would make God an editor and not the author. Absolute creation ex nihilo does not in any way, shape, and form contradict the first law, because the law only applies to existent energy that is present in reality, but it is not trying to explain how energy itself comes to exist in the first place, but shows that once it does, it cannot be created or destroyed. Those are the main, and in my opinion, most convincing objections. However, if you want to see more about this, please let me know, and Lord Jesus Christ be with you. Amen.